Hi. Today I want to talk about the distinction stemming from Aristotle between instrumental goods and intrinsic goods.
Aristotle observed that some things are intrinsically good, or good for their own sake, and some things are instrumentally good, good for the sake of something else.
Aristotle puts it this way: some of the things we seek, that we treat as good, we treat as good because they're good for getting us something else that we want. They're instruments, they're tools, they're ways or means of getting what we'd like. And so those are things we value. They're useful for getting us other things. A paradigm example of that kind of instrumental good is money. It's not that money is in itself a particularly good thing. It's rather that it gets us other good things. It's an excellent instrument for getting us the things we want. Hammers, nails, screwdrivers, other tools are, of course, instruments of the same kind. They're good for producing certain things, for getting us certain things that we want. Other things are intrinsically good. They are good for their own sake. Those intrinsic goods are things we seek not because they get us some further thing, but because they're valuable in themselves. So one way we could look at this distinction is, first of all, think about goods. Aristotle says every art, every action, every inquiry aims at some good. We're always trying to achieve something, whatever that thing is. Now, it might be really good, or it might be something we merely perceive as good, but in any case, there is some end of the activities that we engage in. There's some goal, there's something we're trying to get out of it, and that thing, for the moment, let's just consider those things goods. Some are the endpoints themselves. They're things we're seeking for their own sakes. Those are the intrinsic goods. Other things we're seeking merely for the sake of something else. Those are instrumental goods. Now, actually, these can overlap. So let's draw a little picture of this realm of goods, of the things that we think of as good, either in themselves or for the sake of getting us something else. But now Aristotle's point is, look, not every good can be like that, because then we'd be seeking this good for the sake of some other good, that for the sake of yet some third good, that for a fourth good, and so on and so forth. Eventually, you think we're just chasing this and that and the other thing, and there would be nothing ultimately to ground any of those things. There must be certain things in the end that we treat as intrinsically valuable, as good for their own sake. There's a general style of argument in the background here that is something Aristotle uses again and again. Plato uses it, Aquinas uses it. It comes up again and again in the history of philosophy. And in fact, I will do a video on that special kind of argument. It's a kind of infinite regress argument, really. And the point of it is to say, usually, look, this can't go on forever. Ultimately, there must be something that is outside that set of instrumental goods that actually makes sense of all of those, or at least makes sense of some of them. But in the end, not everything can be simply an instrument for something else. In the end, we must get to something we treat as valuable for its own sake. Those are the intrinsic goods.
Something that is intrinsically good could be listening to music. You listen to music just for the pleasure of the experience of listening to music itself, without a further goal in mind.
So the intrinsic goods are good for their own sake. They're things that are valuable in themselves. Notice I've drawn these circles so that they overlap. Here, to make it a little more readable, are our intrinsic goods. Here are those instrumental goods. Now, some instrumental goods are things we value purely instrumentally. They are merely instruments. Nobody treats them as valuable in themselves. They're instruments for something else. And in some cases, we have, well, the ability. Some people treat certain things as good in themselves, even though most people take them as instruments. Then we have some things where people are divided pretty evenly. Some treat it merely as an instrument for the sake of something else. Others value it intrinsically. Some things most people value intrinsically as valuable in themselves. And then Aristotle says there's only one thing that everyone values always for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. But let's start with the easy category, the things that almost everyone anyway treats merely as instruments. Those are the things that are out here. They're merely instrumental. They're good only for the sake of something else.
Something that is instrumentally good is going for a jog. You might not like how it feels while you're jogging, but you're doing it for the sake of some further end, becoming healthy, a final good.
Now, some things are intrinsically valuable. We value them for their own sake, but also for the sake of something else. And in fact, Aristotle thinks that's a big category, because many things are valuable in themselves, but they also gain us further benefits. And so we might value them for their own sakes, but also for the sake of those further benefits. Or maybe we value them for both, right? We think, yeah, I value this in itself, even if it didn't bring me the further benefits. I would think it's a good thing. But hey, it does, and I value it for that too. So many, many things go in this intermediate category.
Something that is both instrumentally and intrinsically good could be knowledge. There might be something intrinsically good about knowledge, but at the same time it's useful to know things in order to pursue all kinds of other goods.
Over here we've noticed we have money, we have tools, but here we have some very important things. We have virtues. The virtues are valuable in themselves, but they also are useful for the sake of other things. Why? Well, all sorts of reasons. Being courageous, for example, can allow you to accomplish your goals. And so it's a good instrument in addition to being a virtue that is valuable in itself. Courage can lead to victory. And so that's something that makes it valuable in a military context, but in all sorts of other contexts too. You can win by being courageous. And so courage is something that's a very valuable instrument. It can gain you other things you value, but it's also valuable in itself. And the same thing is true of all the other virtues. But it's not only things like that. He would say, well, honor, pleasure, respect of other people. All of those things are things that we value for their own sake, but we also value for the sake of other things. And so that's a big category. The question really becomes, what's out here? What do we value for its own sake and never for the sake of something else? A good is final if it's valued for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. So it's something that anyone treats as an intrinsic good and nobody treats as an instrumental good. It's not in this category of being valued for both reasons. It's always valued purely in itself. Now, what could be like that? That's a contentious question. Aristotle thinks there's an obvious answer, as we'll discuss in another video, happiness. And so he would say there's one and only one thing over in this category of final goods, always intrinsically valued, never instrumentally valued, and that's happiness itself. We're going to talk about what Aristotle means by happiness later. And he might be wrong that it's the only thing in this category. After all, it could well be that other things are things we value intrinsically, for their own sake and never for the sake of something else. When I ask students what else might be in that category, I get proposals like friendship, love. Here's how Aristotle puts the distinction. Since there are evidently more than one end, and we choose some of these, for example, wealth, flutes, and in general instruments, for the sake of something else, clearly not all ends are final ends. But the chief good is evidently something final. So Aristotle is saying, not everything is in this category. Some things are valued for their own sake. And actually, not just for their own sake and for the sake of something else. Now that's possible. It could be that some things are actually here, maybe. But he wants to say, no, actually there are things outside this entire category of things that are valued for the sake of something else. And some of those things surely must be final goods, always valued for their own sake, never for the sake of something else. But if that's right, well, what could that be like?
Now we call what's in itself worthy of pursuit more final than what's worthy of pursuit for the sake of something else, and what's never desirable for the sake of something else more final than the things that are desirable both in themselves and for the sake of that other thing. And therefore we call final without qualification what's always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else. Aristotle.
What things could go into that category other than happiness? Aristotle thinks happiness is all alone here. But you might think there are other things there too. Things like friendship, or love, or a common religious answer, communion with God. First question in the Catechism is, what's the purpose of human life? And the Catechism's answer is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. That is surely something to be valued for its own sake, and not merely for the sake of something else, not even for the sake of our own happiness. The purpose of life is not to be happy, according to that tradition. And of course, you might have many views where, yes, the ultimate purpose of life is not to be happy. It's instead to do good, to contribute to the world, to glorify God, to love one another, etc., etc. There are many possible answers here that different religious traditions and philosophical traditions have given. But it's very common for any ethical theory to say there is something that must be a final good. There must be at least one thing that we value for its own sake and not merely for the sake of other things. And what is that thing? Or what are those things? Well, there are different possible answers. We're going to look at a number of those possible answers as this progresses. Aristotle says happiness, but there are many, many others. How do we go about arguing about those final goods? How do you decide whether happiness is alone here, or there are other potential candidates? Here I have a discouraging word. I don't know. It's very hard to say. And if you look to Aristotle, if you look to Immanuel Kant, if you look to other people who give you a candidate, or maybe several candidates for what belongs over here, and say those things are always to be valued for their own sake and not for the sake of something else, they are to be taken as the ultimate goods, it's very hard to know how to argue about that. And so we might think with Aristotle, it's happiness. We might think with Maimonides that it's happiness and virtue, that there are two things over there. You might think with the Catechism that it involves glorifying God and enjoying Him forever. But notice that's actually two things, glorifying God and enjoying communion with God. That's really two. But then you might have all sorts of other views. G.E. Moore thought there were two things that belonged there, human relationships and the experience of beauty. But there are many other options. So, in thinking about those problems, when we turn to G.E. Moore or the religious tradition or Aristotle or Kant and say, what's your argument? How do you rule out the other candidates? We get discouraged. There aren't many arguments. And so a deep question that I want to leave you with is, it's pretty easy to draw the distinction between instrumental goods and intrinsic goods. But when we try to identify what might be out here in this category of things that are always valued for their own sake and not for the sake of something else, it's very hard to know what to place here and how to argue about whether it belongs there, number one, and number two, whether it's the only thing that belongs there. When we start hitting that kind of question and looking for arguments, we're going to find we're very near rock bottom, and it's going to be hard to find some way of justifying the stance we take.